The studio, in 1972, was a cathedral of unfinished ambition, a place where the air was thick with the residue of what's going on. Marvin Gaye, at 33, was navigating the strange, hollow aftermath of artistic totalization. He had captured the soul of a nation, documented its wars, its systemic failures, and its desperate, fraying hope. Having achieved that, having spoken for everyone, he found himself suddenly, terrifyingly, silent. He stood at the center of the room, looking for a way to translate the macrocosm of global suffering into the microcosm of a singular, beating heart. The project he began was meant to be a theological exploration, a series of sonic meditations on the intersection of the carnal and the celestial, a thesis on how human touch might function as a sacrament, a bridge to the divine. He was searching for transcendence, for a way to make the physical body a vessel for spiritual enlightenment. The tapes were rolling, capturing the early sketches of a journey toward the infinite. Then, the atmosphere shifted with the weight of a sudden atmospheric change. It was a Tuesday in 1973. Janis Hunter, 17, walked through the door. She was the daughter of Ed Townsend, the man tasked with helping Marvin articulate his vision. She was not a professional. She was a presence. She was vitality, unformed and immediate. Marvin's reaction was not a choice, it was an event. It was a gravitational pull that defied the geography of his current life, the logic of his career, and the conventions of his age. In that moment, the theological architecture he had been painstakingly drafting, the abstract concepts of the divine and the connection, collapsed, and in its place stood a singular, undeniable reality. The divine was no longer a philosophical construct. It was a face. It was a voice. It was a 17-year-old girl standing in a recording studio. And for Marvin, the trajectory of his life and the music he was born to make changed in the span of a single afternoon. The studio sessions underwent a radical, quiet transformation. The sweeping, ethereal concepts that Marvin had been chasing were discarded, not because they were false, but because they were suddenly insufficient. He had been looking for a way to describe love as a category, but now he was forced to confront love as a person. The shift was absolute. Every lyric that had been written as a general testament to human connection was re-injected with the specific, potent electricity of his attraction to Janis. The title track, Let's Get It On, which had been written before her arrival, suddenly gained a target. It became a map, a desperate, honest, and profoundly human invitation directed at a specific soul. The song transformed from an abstract meditation into a direct, vulnerable plea. This was not a calculated shift for marketability. It was an act of surrender. Marvin stopped playing the part of the prophet and started playing the part of the man. When the album was released in August 1973, it became a phenomenon. Yet the world's reception was a fascinating misreading. Popular culture, in its rush to categorize, labeled it a seduction record. It became the shorthand for intimacy, the auditory equivalent of candlelight, the background track for private encounters. The world heard a command. They heard a smooth, assured voice orchestrating a moment of conquest. But they were wrong. They were listening to the surface, hearing the cadence and the texture of the production, but missing the interiority of the performance. If you listen closely, stripping away the decades of cultural shorthand, you do not hear a man of command. You hear a man of profound vulnerability. You hear the tremor in his voice as he asks to be understood. You hear a man who has been moved off his axis and is simply trying, with every fiber of his being, to reach across the distance to the one person who caused the shift. The getting it on was not a demand. It was a prayer. The years that followed were not the fairy tale the album's success might suggest. They were a crucible. Marvin was still legally and emotionally tethered to his past. His marriage to Anna Gordy Gaye was a knot that could not be easily untied, a massive, tangled structure of shared history, financial obligation, and emotional debt. The period between 1973 and their eventual marriage in 1977 was a slow, painful endurance test. Janis was not a passive figure in this. She was a participant in her own right, navigating the wreckage of Marvin's life, his fluctuating moods, his genius, and his profound, deep-seated damage. They were living in a liminal space, in a world where their love was a secret and a burden all at once. This was the reality of the muse. She was not a static image on an album cover. She was a person living through the volatility of a man who was, in many ways, falling apart while trying to hold a world together. By the time the marriage was formalized in 1977, the bloom of the first electric meeting had long since been weathered by the storms of the industry, the legal battles, and the relentless, grinding pressure of Marvin's internal life. The music reflected this maturation. The album I Want You, released in 1976, was not the bright, singular hunger of Let's Get It On. It was darker, moodier, more complex. It was the sound of a love that had moved past the initial blinding strike of attraction and had settled into the long-term, agonizing process of coexistence. It was the sound of desire that had been tested by time and was now burdened by the reality of being human. Marvin was, at this stage, a man who was becoming increasingly aware that the love he craved, the transcendent, healing, all-encompassing love, was constantly being sabotaged by his own inability to sustain the environment it required. The marriage ended in 1981, a dissolution that was as messy and human as the beginnings were cinematic. When the final papers were filed, Marvin was in Belgium, fighting a different kind of war, trying to piece himself back together through the creation of sexual healing. Once again, the pattern held. The wound was the work. He could not separate his suffering from his art. He viewed love not as a source of stability, but as a mechanism for healing, a way to address the parts of himself that were otherwise inaccessible. Janis Hunter's reflection on their time together remains a testament to the complexity of loving a genius who is also a man in decline. She never painted him as a saint or a villain. She painted him as a man with a bottomless capacity to feel and a limited, tragic capacity to sustain the very things he loved most. It was an accounting, not a judgment. Today, Let's Get It On remains a monolith in the history of recorded music. It is a song that everyone knows, even if they don't know the story. It plays in the background of weddings, in the scenes of films, and on the radio waves that never quite stop circulating its melody. It has become a part of the cultural fabric, a piece of music so ubiquitous that its specific, sharp-edged origins have been sanded down by familiarity. But at the heart of that gargantuan success is a simple, singular moment. A 33-year-old man, tired and searching, who walked into a studio and found his world redirected by a 17-year-old girl. He didn't write an album about a hookup. He didn't write an album about a seduction. He wrote an album about the act of falling, the terrifying, uncontrollable sensation of feeling yourself drift toward someone else with such force that you have no choice but to name it. The world took that offering and used it for its own purposes. It took the most vulnerable thing Marvin Gaye had ever done and turned it into the most popular, and in doing so, stripped it of its original, fragile context. But the record remains, a monument to the moment he decided that the most important thing he could do was not to lead a movement, but to be a man who asked to be received. He was asking for more than just physical touch. He was asking for recognition. He was asking to be seen by the one person who had arrived without warning and changed the architecture of his universe. Every time the song plays and someone mistakes it for something casual, they are missing the desperate, singular, and deeply human truth of its creation. It was never a record about how to get someone into bed. It was a record about a man who was completely undone by the sudden, overwhelming realization that he had finally found a home in someone else's eyes. It was a document of a soul in motion, reaching out, not from a position of power, but from a position of absolute, unshielded need. The world calls it a classic, a standard, a smooth groove, but the interior reality is far more jagged, far more beautiful, and far more honest than the reception ever dared to admit. It was the sound of a man standing in a room, watching a door open, and knowing that his life, as he knew it, was effectively over, and that the new one, however difficult, was starting right then in that fleeting, impossibly brief, and transformative Tuesday afternoon. He gave that fall to the world, and we, in our infinite capacity for simplification, spent 50 years turning his greatest vulnerability into our favorite piece of background noise. But if you listen, if you really listen past the cultural myth, you can hear him still, trembling behind the microphone, asking, simply and directly, to be received. It is the most human sound ever captured on tape, the sound of a man who has lost his guard and found his subject, and is begging the world to understand that the desire was never about a category, but about this one specific, irreplaceable person. The transcendence he was looking for in the beginning wasn't found in the divine or in the philosophy of the spirit. It was found in the person. And that, ultimately, is the only kind of transcendence that ever really matters. He was a man who survived his own genius only to be humbled by his own humanity. And in the end, that is the legacy of Let's Get It On. It is not a guide to romance. It is a confession of the soul. It is the sound of a man finding out that he is, after all, only human, and that being human, with all the mess, the age gaps, the complications, and the desire, is the most profound work of all. He walked into that room as an icon and walked out as a man in love. And the album he made is the record of that transition, a permanent sonic map of the exact moment a heart decides that the risk of being known is worth the cost of being vulnerable. The song continues to play, a ghost in the machine of our culture, a testament to a man who, for one afternoon, had the courage to put his armor down and let the world see him exactly as he was, wanting, reaching, and completely, utterly caught in the gravity of someone else's presence.